Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Quantum Spirituality on Dreamvisions 7 RadioNetwork.com, the show where past spiritual wisdom and present-day science merge to show us our future. Your host is Peter Canova, author of the 25-time award-winning book series, The First Souls Trilogy, available on Amazon, and Peter's website, petercanova.com. That's PeterCanova.com. This show is a live video, so if you're only listening and want to watch, go to Peter's website, petercanova.com. PeterCanova.com, where you can access his Facebook page to leave comments or questions, and click the D7RN link where you can receive a free gift video.
Hello, friends, followers, and listeners. I'm your host from Quantum Spirituality, Peter Canova. This is the show where the past and the present merge to unlock the mysteries of our future. I just want to remind our new listeners that you may want to go back and listen to the first 3 shows, because this show builds one episode on the other. It's kind of instructional in a way. And in the first 3 episodes in particular, we provide a framework to understand some of the issues that we speak of on quantum physics and on spirituality in the later episodes. So we have a great show lined up for you today. And without any further delay, please listen to it and enjoy. And join us every Tuesday, first Tuesday of every month, for Quantum Spirituality. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to a new episode of Quantum Spirituality. After a brief pause we had, because there's a lot of interesting things going on, been really busy. We have the Pope Annalisa project, getting Pope Annalisa into a TV series, which is going forward full blast. We just finished developing the materials that we're going to be bringing around to talk to the various actors, directors, and eventually the networks. I'm working with a very accomplished director and an ex-HBO executive, which is my associates, my team, and I feel good about our chances of getting this done. It's everybody that reads the book and everybody that looks at this project really loves it. So we have high hopes that we're going to get it done. And also the Quantum Spirituality book. I've just finished the final edits working with my publisher. The book is scheduled to come out in December. In fact, it's on pre-sale right now. If you Google Quantum Spirituality, Peter Canova, it should bring you to the Amazon site where you can pre-order the book. And I will be giving you updates from time to time on the progress of where we stand and if anything changes. But right now, it should be coming out sometime December, possibly January of early next year. So today's show, we're going to kind of go back to the basics. We have a lot of new listeners every month. There's about 7,000 or 8,000 new listeners every month to the show. It's grown really quite large. We were up to somewhere in the vicinity of over 500,000 listeners right now. And so I wanted to go back to really one of the 2 legs that underpin this show, and that's to talk about the Gnostics. And if you are a follower of the show, you know what we like to do here is we take these ancient spiritual texts and we compare them to the findings of modern quantum physics, and we show how it's astonishing how 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, so many of the theories of quantum physics were predicted by the Gnostics. So what's the importance of this to you? Well, the importance is this. We're talking about reality here. And if you just look at ancient texts, a lot of people say, well, it's kind of far out, interesting. But when you start to hear science and ancient spirituality act like bookends, talking about the nature of reality and what the creation was about, what consciousness is. I mean, it's incredible because it awakens you to the fact that we are just one of a number of dimensions that are out there, probably the lowest one out there, and that we're supported by other dimensions of existence. So that has huge implications. It has huge implications not only for what we can do and how we lead this life, but it has big implications for the afterlife also. if reality, as we've been taught in many religious beliefs, if there is an afterlife and reality extends, or as science would say, consciousness extends beyond this existence, it's a pretty major discovery. So, I don't think anybody will ever get a smoking gun while we're still in this body, but one of the things that you can do when you achieve a certain level of mastery is experience things out of body, experience a higher consciousness, in effect, which is really your own consciousness operating at another dimension, another dimensional level. So we're going to talk today about the Gnostics and why, what they did, why they were important to the modern world. And I think that you're going to find it very, very interesting and very informative. But remember, at the end of the day, the purpose of this show and the purpose of all the books I write and everything I do is to have you become your own guru, have you become your own prophet, have you become the person that experiences the enlightenment and the revelation, so that you're not taking it on the word of third parties. Because when you really think about it, you can have people tell you that fire burns, but until you put your hand in that fire and you feel it yourself, you don't really own it. What this show is about and what all my books are about are to help you own your existence, help you own your understanding about what your life's purpose is and where you are heading. So anyway, I hope you enjoy the show today. Let's get on with it, and I think you'll find it very informative.
The Gnostics.
Okay, so who were these guys, and why should we care at all about a bunch of 2,000-year-old mystics? Well, if you have any curiosity at all about life, and you've been seeking for answers in religion or from science about questions like why are we here, what's our purpose, how did life start, the basic fundamental questions about life that we all ask ourselves every day. But the Gnostics had incredible answers to all these questions. In fact, they were so on point that they predicted most of the theories of modern psychology and quantum physics, as I describe in detail in my book, Quantum Spirituality. But let's get a little bit of background on the Gnostics, because it's extremely interesting. The fact is, we would hardly know anything about the Gnostics today, because the early Christian church did such a number on them as to make them practically extinct along with all their works. And the only way up until 1945 that we knew very much about the Gnostics at all was through the writings of their enemies, the early church fathers, and what they had to say about them. But in 1945, something very significant happened. A bunch of Egyptian brothers were combing the base of mountain caves looking for manure, and they happened to stumble upon a bunch of earthenware jars in one of these caves. And they debated whether or not to open it up, because they thought they might be unleashing a jinn, or a genie as we call it. But then they also realized that there were often valuable finds in places like this, and their greed overcame their superstition, thinking there might be gold in them, their pots. But as they broke them open, to their disappointment, a bunch of papyrus documents, scrolls, tumbled out of the jars. And these scrolls were written primarily in Coptic, which was the ancient Egyptian language before the Arab conquest, written in a sort of Greek-type alphabet. They understood enough of what they saw to realize that it had to do with Christians, and their first instinct was, well, this has nothing to do with us, them being Muslims. But they decided to take the scrolls home anyway. And unfortunately, the mother used many of the scrolls to use for kindling wood or fire for her cooking. And unfortunately, we lost a lot of documents that way. But there was another twist to this story. The brothers, as it turns out, had murdered a man who had murdered their father. It was a pretty grisly tale that I won't go into detail here, but it was like something out of an Indiana Jones or a horror film. And the police started to investigate. So, fearing that the documents in their possession would cause them problems, they gave them to a Coptic Orthodox priest, who in turn gave them to a Cypriot antiquities dealer, and eventually they appeared on the Egyptian black market, where they were picked up by some European scholars. The scholars came to realize that they were looking at original documents, original texts from the Gnostic heresy that was suppressed by the Orthodox Catholic Church and pretty much disappeared from the world around 400 AD. This wasn't a mere academic find, because the contents of these Gospels had the power to literally reshape our whole vision of Western history. Now let's see why that is. Throughout the ancient world, there existed mystery schools. These were places where the spiritual wisdom of the ages was taught and passed on in an unbroken line of knowledge. Mystery school temples could be found in all lands and all cultures around the ancient world. You can think of the mystery schools as a kind of loosely knit ancient Ivy League network of learning, where the adepts would be trained in various things like spiritualism, geometry, mathematics, anything that had to do with preparing them for an experience with a higher consciousness, because the end goal of all the mystery schools was to have their initiates experience a super consciousness, in effect, that led them to understand that the world that we live in was only the tip of the iceberg, what was visible, that there were many dimensions of existence from which we derived, and that's what they were really trying to teach their students. This network of mystery schools really stretched from the British Isles all the way through the Mediterranean into Egypt and through Persia and India, and they all had various forms, but they did have common core principles, which are often called the perennial philosophy. And it was a statement of core principles that any of the adepts or initiates of any of the schools in any part of the world would have recognized. Now, when Alexander conquered the East, that meant that the Hellenistic world, Hellenistic culture, literally stretched from the rocks of Gibraltar all the way into India. And it opened up tremendous routes, not only of trade and intermixture of peoples, but tremendous knowledge that was now dispersed throughout the Hellenistic Empire, so that the influences we see of the spiritual traditions would have come from places like India, Persia, Egypt itself, Israel, and their confluence would have been in the Greco-Roman city, what became the Greco-Roman city of Alexandria, Egypt, which was the greatest center of learning at its time in the ancient world. It was the repository of the great library of Alexandria. But basically, Alexandria became the hotbed of all this knowledge, this mystical knowledge from different parts of the world. And the Gnostics centered in the city of Alexandria. So the Gnostics were the beneficiaries of all this fantastic ancient knowledge, Greek philosophy and influences from India, Persia, Israel, and the ancient Kabbalah and the Egyptian Hermetic tradition, all were available to these Gnostics, who essentially developed their spiritual branch from the time prior to Christ, from hundreds of years prior to Christ, right on through the Christian era. The Gnostics exemplified this universal wisdom tradition, and we can sum it up with a few points here. First, that God, or consciousness, is the one and only energy and substance that exists. Everything visible, which is matter, and invisible energy, is an expression of the one consciousness. Light is the vehicle by which consciousness manifests itself. Light is intelligent energy. The one consciousness disperses itself into many points of consciousness to experience itself from multiple perspectives as individual beings.
and the one consciousness achieves individuality by limiting its consciousness of itself. I'll explain some of these points in detail in a few minutes, but first we have to understand the relationship between Gnosticism and Christianity. Gnosticism had been developing for hundreds or even thousands of years, and then all of a sudden Jesus appears on the scene with his ministry in Palestine. But where did Jesus and his radical teachings come from? Was he a singular, unique event, a divine presence just kind of plopped down into our midst, or is there more to it than that? He will be called a Nazarene. What's significant about the name Nazarene or Nazarene? No historical records exist around the time of Jesus of a town called Nazareth. But we do have several sources that talk of a sect of Jews called the Essenes. The Essenes were a non-conforming Jewish sect that didn't accept the law of the temple as it was commonly observed by the other Jews. They were not located in one geographical area, but rather scattered around ancient Israel. There was a northern branch of the Essenes called the Nazari in Greek, or the Nazareans in English. They were said to be vegetarians, mystics, and healers by many sources. And they predated Jesus. They predated Christianity. So, as you see in the quote here, that there really is no chance that Jesus would be called a Nazarene or a Nazarene because he came from a town called Nazareth, rather than the probability is that he lived in the area of influence of the Nazareans, and his parents may well have belonged to this sect of Essenes. Now, the Nazareans dwelt right at the foot of Mount Carmel, which is one of the holiest sites in all of Israel. Carmel was the home of various mystical schools and mystical traditions. It's said that the temple of Isaiah, one of the holiest temples of all Israel, was on the top of Mount Carmel. We also have records that the great Greek mystic philosopher Pythagoras studied at a mystery school on the top of Carmel. The mountain was considered so holy that no permanent structures could be erected on it. But during the summertime, the Essene community would scale from the base up to the mountainside and dwell in white tent structures temporarily, and then when the colder months hit, they would go back down into the valley below. The Essenes had been around Carmel for a very long time. In fact, it was said that they were part of the 10,000 mystics that Moses had specially trained that did receive the inner teachings of God that were not part of the 10 commandments that were given into the Jewish masses. So it's very likely that Jesus was a Nazarene, meaning a Nazarene Essene, and came from that tradition, came from that mystical tradition. So it shouldn't be surprising when evidence indicates that Jesus was teaching a Gnostic message. Just as Moses before him had given the masses the 10 commandments, but had trained a number of mystics in inner teachings, so Jesus had two different sets of teachings. We have direct verification of the two teachings mentioned in the Bible from the early church fathers, highly regarded church fathers, Clement of Alexandria and Origen, both of whom were bishops of Alexandria at one time or another. And Clement says that there was a secret gospel, a spiritual gospel, that did not describe the hierophantic or secret teachings of God, because those were most carefully guarded and given only to those who were being initiated into the great mysteries, but nonetheless was a more spiritual gospel than what was in circulation for the public. And Origen affirms again that Jesus taught to the disciples in private in their retreats the sacred gospel of God, but the things that he taught could not be adequately conveyed to the multitude in writing. So here again, we have the strong indications that there were both a public outer teaching, a simpler teaching, and a more, let's say, complicated esoteric or mystical teaching that were being taught to those who had the capability to understand it.
Okay, it's that time for a short commercial break. This is Quantum Spirituality on Dreamvisions 7 Radio. I'm your host, Peter Canova, and you can go to my website, petercanova.com. That's petercanova.com, where you can get the link to watch the video version of this podcast and also get a lot of information that we can't always cover on any individual program. So we'll be back shortly with a lot of more interesting news. Don't go away. Keep that dial tuned.
The First Souls Trilogy, one of the most highly awarded fictional independent book series on the market, is a grand vision of human evolution. It chronicles the first spirit consciousness to enter the material world in 3 page-turning novels that introduce a new paradigm of reality based on genuine ancient wisdom and quantum science. These inspirational thrillers will force you to rethink the nature of the world in which we live. Visit the petercanova.com website for information and ordering. In a world facing annihilation, a miraculous African nun rises to become the first female pope through a web of war, murder, and betrayal. Loved by some, hated by many, she becomes the deadly target of Islamic terrorists and her own cardinals as she introduces a new vision that will either save humanity or accelerate its destruction. 4 people must race against a nuclear holocaust to learn her astonishing secret. Pope Annalisa is available at petercanova.com, Amazon, and other online booksellers and bookstores worldwide.
Why are we here? How can we be happy? Questions asked from millennials to boomers. Crappy to Happy, Sacred Stories of Transformational Joy answers them using true stories of grit, grace, and love. James Redfield, author of The Celestine Prophecy, wrote in the foreword, "This book is a seminar about emerging truths and offers grounded solutions through the art of the comeback." Dr. Bernie Siegel, a contributing author, wrote, "Bodies die, but spirits and consciousness survive and recycle." So, grab some tissues, open your book, and prepare to cry and laugh till it heals. Crappy to Happy by Reverend Ariel Patricia and Kathleen O'Keefe Canavas. Available from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and booksellers worldwide.
How did life start on Earth, and why is there so much suffering? Are we living in a simulated reality like the characters in the Matrix movie? Do parallel dimensions exist alongside ours, influencing our experience? What are the mysterious dark energies that penetrate our universe? Peter Canova folds space and time to bring the twin bookends of ancient wisdom and quantum science into a single focal point, answering these and many other deep mysteries of the creation. Quantum Spirituality can be heard every Tuesday at 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. Eastern and 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. Pacific on syndicated Dreamvisions 7 Radio Network. See the show where past and present merge to show us our future.
This is Dreamvisions 7 Radio Network, uniting mankind with universal love. Our shows are created from the heart, bringing each listener to a place of divine enlightenment. Breathe, relax, and enjoy. Let life flow.
Welcome back to Quantum Spirituality on Dreamvision7radio.com. I'm your host, Peter Canova, and you can find out more about me at petercanova.com. That's PeterCanova.com. And please, if you enjoy the show and have any questions or comments for me, you can leave them on my Facebook page, Peter Canova Author, or also you can access my website and leave any comments there.
I also want to remind everybody that Quantum Spirituality is now available for pre-sales on Amazon. And if you take a look at the link below the book here and copy that down and go to the site, you can reserve yourself a copy. We expect them to sell very well when they finally hit the market, and it will really cover so much more in depth what we're talking about here today, and then some, to really give you a complete picture of knowledge about what reality is about and what our world is about and our place in it. So please don't miss this opportunity to order Quantum Spirituality. Let's take a moment to contemplate the creation. So how did all this come about? Well, within Christianity, early Christianity, you had two divergent views. One was of the Gnostic Christians, the other was of the orthodox Christians. The orthodox view of God was like an old stern judge who kind of waved his hand and a separate creation was formed, so that any other source of life that appeared afterwards would have been separate from the source that had created it. The Gnostic conception of God and creation was substantially different. God was all-pervasive mind or consciousness. God did not create anything. Rather, God emanated everything that exists. Creation is to make something different from yourself, different from the source of creation. Emanation is to project the very essence of the source that is manifesting something. In this case, manifesting the creation, life, and the universe, and everything in it. So here's a diagram showing how the Gnostics viewed creation. The source, which would be called the supreme consciousness, the first thought, the first mind, or you can call it God, was at the center of everything. The source was everything. It was the substance, it was the energy, it was everything that had to do with creation. And it projected from itself other centers of consciousness. And you can see that in these concentric rings. And these centers of consciousness were called aeons, which means eternities in Greek. They were separate beings, but you can think of them as separate sources of intelligence, vast currents of intelligence. Don't think of them as people. And they had names. They were in pairs. They were always male-female pairs. So you would have mind, truth, word, life, maternal love, will, and wisdom. And there were a number of others. And you notice that in the dotted line on the outside, it says audacity, opposition. This was like a force that permeated the creation. Opposition essentially has to do with free will. It was a choice that was given to these beings that were projected from the source. And in order to have a true sense of individuality, these beings had to have the choice of whether or not to blindly follow or completely follow the will of the source itself, or pursue their own will, pursue their own desires. So opposition was a force that was present at the very beginning of the creation, and it had everything to do with the ability for individuals to appear outside the source. The source itself emanated these other points of consciousness as a way of understanding itself. It was a matter of self-reflection. All these, the terms that you see, mind, truth, will, wisdom, and so forth, these are basically archetypes. Now, an archetype is an ideal or a principle. So essentially, what we're looking at here is different aspects of the source itself. The source was assumed to be good, all goodness, and it projected out these beings that would typify different aspects of itself or emphasize different aspects of itself. So outside of the area that you see here, which incidentally this was called the pleroma or heaven, the source, and the archetypes or the eons that evolved around it, these beings were considered in their totality the basis of heaven for the Gnostics. And just outside the heaven was the shadow, which was chaos. Now, chaos was an area of potential. It was the area that was unorganized by the source. It was left open. It was kind of like a blank check of potential where other things could occur. Chaos, in effect, was the mind space where the will of the individual beings could be expressed, apart from the totality or the harmony of the pleroma itself, which incidentally the Greek word pleroma means the fullness of the totality, which would have been of one mind, one thought, individual spirits, but subordinating their will to the will of the one, as opposed to spirits that were placing their will or desires before the will of the one. Now, I have to go off on a little sidebar here because these things get somewhat complicated. I've been speaking of individual spirits or separate beings, and yes, they were, but in reality, it's an illusion. So, if you really think about it, how can the everything be anything other than itself? How can it have anything besides itself in its own sphere of existence? Well, it really can't. The only way it can happen is through an illusion. And the illusion is that the one consciousness, in order to create separate points of consciousness, essentially has to dumb itself down. It has to limit its consciousness of itself in order to experience itself as something other than itself. So essentially all being is a limitation of the one supreme consciousness. And in that limitation, it's able to perceive itself as something separate, when in reality, everything is all of one mind, everything is all of one substance. I know it gets a bit complicated, but it's kind of a form of divine amnesia in effect. The Hindus called it Maya or illusion. And when you hear the word illusion attached to spiritual wisdom, essentially this is what it means, that there's a perception of individuality, there is a perception of separate being, when the reality is that everything is one. Now, as to how the actual physical universe came about, the story, according to the Gnostics, was that the last of the eons or spiritual beings created was wisdom, or Sophia, as she was called in Greek. Sophia means wisdom in the Greek language. And Sophia had the desire to create something on her own, to pursue her own individual desires. Sophia, as you can see in the diagram, was on the outer part of the pleroma, the part that bordered onto chaos. And that kind of makes sense when you come to think about it, because wisdom is always on the frontier of experience and the frontier of learning, because that's how wisdom grows. Wisdom grows by experience. So Sophia plunges herself into chaos, and the results were very unforeseen. Something new occurred, because chaos was not something that was empty. It was a source of potential, but it was not something that was empty. It contained what the Gnostics called proto-matter, or that which comes before matter. Essentially, in modern quantum physical terms, you would have called them inert virtual particles. And they activated with Sophia's high energy. Upon the contact with her high divine energy, these potential particles, literally, these virtual particles, literally came to life, and they started to move, and they started to activate, and they essentially became the basis or the substance for the matter which was to come later on. It was now something new had appeared on the landscape here. Before, it was all spiritual energy, invisible energy. Now there was a denser form of energy which was called matter that had resulted as Sophia had mixed with these virtual particles. Now, this story is literally describing numerous de facto quantum theories, but it's not our intention to cover those angles here. That's something that I go into detail in the book Quantum Spirituality, and we have a little bit of a different focus here today. Now, we should also understand that the contact that Sophia made with these virtual particles not only activated the virtual particles, which led eventually to the formation of matter in a material dimension, but Sophia's energy, in turn, was also lowered. It was dimmed. She cries out to heaven, in fact, in the Gnostic text, in alarm about losing her divine energy, that it's being siphoned off, that she's becoming as heavy weighing matter. And that's really an important part of the symbology of this story. And the symbology is really tremendous if you really understand how to decipher it. You remember the first principle of the mystical wisdom that we showed, that consciousness is everything. Well, this story of Sophia is describing how consciousness descended in order to form physical existence and the physical world and the human being. Conscious energy manipulated matter into existence. That's Einstein's E equals mc squared, where everybody knows now in the scientific world that matter comes from light energy. But in order to do so, consciousness had to step its vibration down, which is another way of saying consciousness had to limit itself. And we spoke about this whole thing about limitation of consciousness before as the basis for forming existence outside of the everything, outside of the static unity that was the oneness. To experience individuality, the conscious energy has to step itself down, because otherwise, if it did all this in its high state of consciousness, there couldn't really be anything individual, because anything individual would be absorbed into the consciousness of all there is, of everything. So by necessity, in order to create at these lower levels, dimensional levels, such as in the psychic level or the material level, consciousness had to step itself down. And that's the symbology of Sophia's energy being drained off as she activates this new dimension of matter. Now, it's legitimate to ask yourself at this state, well, why was this being that fell from the higher dimensions wisdom in the first place? Because why would wisdom put itself in a situation where it falls from a higher to a lower state of energy? Well, remember that wisdom can only grow through experience, through knowledge and experience. But we're talking about a particular type of knowledge here, not like a type of knowledge where somebody tells you something and you have to take it on faith. This is knowledge by direct experience. And when the Gnostics, and the very term Gnostic means to know, when the Gnostics spoke about knowing, they were talking about having a direct experience with consciousness, not on some hearsay. So it really kind of stands to reason that it would be the wisdom aspect of God that would fall from the higher planes, because wisdom was seeking a new experience. It was seeking new knowledge. And therefore, wisdom would be the logical one of the archetypes or the archetypal beings, the aspect of God that would fall from this higher state of consciousness into a lower state of consciousness in order to experience itself in a different state of existence. Remember, according to the mystics, at the end of the day, it was all rather a kind of cosmic mind game where God would set itself up with these individual points of consciousness that were like mirrors pointing back to itself, so that the way that the supreme consciousness really knows itself has to be in contrast with other points of consciousness. And these other points of consciousness would be spiritual beings that would essentially be like mirrors reflecting back on the supreme being. So the supreme being knew itself in context of something, because in order to know yourself, you have to have something with which to contrast yourself. If you're everything and you have nothing else to contrast yourself with, then it's really a situation where you're living in a kind of eternal cycle of not knowing, of not understanding, of not being aware. And the one thing that all spiritual and religious texts point to is the impetus of some force, some supreme force, trying to awaken and become aware of itself. And that's what life and individual life really is all about. It's part of that chain of awareness. Now, why did I say at the beginning of the program that this represents a radically different vision for the Western world that was suppressed by the Catholic Church? Well, the very reason is that you can see, according to the Gnostic understanding, according to the Gnostic Christian understanding, which was the original Christianity, we are part of that supreme consciousness. We're not separate from it. We're not these little wind-up dolls that were left here in a lunatic asylum to bounce around with no purpose. We are part of this stream of consciousness. We contain this spark of the divine consciousness within us. Now, the question is, why are we not aware of that? Why is life here on earth so difficult if, in fact, we were descendants of this higher consciousness? It all comes back to that force of opposition that we showed in the earlier diagram. The force of opposition is that which allows us choice, and you can choose to be or do anything you want, no matter how bad or how good. The problem is that at this level of consciousness, that we had to diminish ourselves in order to have a sense of individual experience, we also lost that higher sense of consciousness that keeps us essentially bound to this dimension, bound to these lower dimensions. We have the potential to reawaken, but our own choices have led us into a state of sleeping, in effect, a state of slumber, where we have forgotten our higher natures. And this is where we have to work through our lifetimes in order to reawaken and grow spiritually and recapture that higher state that we once knew. This is done by various means of study, meditation, spiritual practice, and also seeking wisdom from others who are in a more enlightened state. Eventually, if you work at it, you can begin to have extraordinary experiences. I had them myself. Other people have had them. Many other people have had them. I'm nothing exceptional. And you won't really know it until you see it or until you feel it. But I promise you that it is out there. And if you do work at it, that you can start to see things in a non-ordinary way and have non-ordinary experiences that will lead you to understand that there are other dimensions out there other than the dimensions of the five senses and physicality. But I will also tell you that the force of opposition is present in all aspects of life, and it will work against you. It will work to keep you in the lower state that most of us find ourselves in. And we're going to discuss some of the ways that that opposition manifests in our lives right after the break.
It's time for another break. Don't go away. I'm your host, Peter Canova, and you're listening to Quantum Spirituality on Dreamvision7radio.com. We'll be right back.
The First Souls Trilogy, one of the most highly awarded fictional independent book series on the market, is a grand vision of human evolution. It chronicles the first spirit consciousness to enter the material world in 3 page-turning novels that introduce a new paradigm of reality based on genuine ancient wisdom and quantum science. These inspirational thrillers will force you to rethink the nature of the world in which we live. Visit the petercanova.com website for information and ordering. In a world facing annihilation, a miraculous African nun rises to become the first female pope through a web of war, murder, and betrayal. Loved by some, hated by many, she becomes the deadly target of Islamic terrorists and her own cardinals as she introduces a new vision that will either save humanity or accelerate its destruction. 4 people must race against a nuclear holocaust to learn her astonishing secret. Pope Annalisa is available at petercanova.com, Amazon, and other online booksellers and bookstores worldwide.
What if dreams can diagnose your life? What if we can meet the love of our life in dreams? Join host Kat O'Keefe Canovis, the #1 internationally best-selling author of Dreams That Can Save Your Life, written with Duke University medical doctor Larry Burke. Dreaming Healing is where we'll explore dreams, research, and interpret dreams from you, the caller. Dreaming Healing shows can be heard every Tuesday at 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. Eastern, with live shows on the first and third evenings at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific Time on syndicated Dreamvisions 7 Radio Network. Come live your dreams out loud with Kat.
How did life start on Earth, and why is there so much suffering? Are we living in a simulated reality like the characters in the Matrix movie? Do parallel dimensions exist alongside ours, influencing our experience? What are the mysterious dark energies that penetrate our universe? Peter Canova folds space and time to bring the twin bookends of ancient wisdom and quantum science into a single focal point, answering these and many other deep mysteries of the creation. Quantum Spirituality can be heard every Tuesday at 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. Eastern and 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. Pacific on syndicated Dreamvisions 7 Radio Network. See the show where past and present merge to show us our future.
This is Dreamvisions 7 Radio Network, uniting mankind with universal love. Our shows are created from the heart, bringing each listener to a place of divine enlightenment. Breathe, relax, and enjoy. Let life flow.
Welcome back to the last segment of our Quantum Spirituality Show on syndicated Dreamvisions7radio.com. And I'm your host, Peter Canova. You can listen to the show anytime online, on your phone, in cars with Bluetooth, and through Amazon's Echo by asking Alexa, play Dreamvision 7 Radio Network. If you have a question or comment, please leave it on my website, petercanova.com, where you can also link to my Facebook page to comment.
I'd like to remind everybody one last time that Quantum Spirituality will be out around December of this year or January of next year, but it is available currently for pre-ordering. You can go to my website, petercanova.com, or just copy down the URL that you see, or the link that you see at the bottom of the book here. We expect the book to sell extremely well. There's a lot of followers from the first Souls trilogy, which was the 25-time award-winning geopolitical spiritual thriller, and a lot of people know from the talks that I've given publicly that quantum spirituality is the basis for all the material in the fictional trilogy. This is the first non-fiction book that I have written, and it's the result of about 40 years worth of research, 40 years worth of research, but it's all in one package. It puts everything together. It's a whole delving into the nature of reality from a scientific and from a spiritual standpoint. So I think a lot of you listeners here will find it extremely interesting. So please try and look that up when you have a chance. Okay, so you remember in the previous segment how we discussed that the force of opposition was that force from the very foundation of the creation that was necessary for free choice. Well, the force of opposition, like consciousness, worked its way down through the lower levels, and it became even more difficult, or you might even say more sinister, at these lower levels of consciousness. Now, keep in mind the Gnostic picture that we presented here, that there are numerous levels of consciousness. And this whole idea of opposition plays out at each of those levels. So, really what it comes down to is that our level of consciousness here is actually influenced by other unseen levels of consciousness, both for what we would call the good and what we would call for the ill. And what I'm going to explain to you from this point on is the Reader's Digest version, because we have limited time left in the show. And also, we have covered this in detail in some previous shows, and also it's going to be covered in greater detail in the book Quantum Spirituality. But essentially, at some level, our consciousness went so far downhill that our bad choices came back to appear to us in the concept of evil or something not good, when in reality it is really a projection. It's all a projection of our own limited minds. And this collective lack of consciousness fed this force of opposition, in effect created this force of opposition almost. And then it seemed to us that this force of opposition was an entity unto itself. The Gnostics described this force as the demiurge or the archon. And the manifestation of this force can be found in anything that leads humanity into a cul-de-sac where they have a limited view such that they can't really contact the higher source of reality within themselves, the spark of the divine that comes from us being projections of the one supreme source. And this can happen in a very widespread and insidious fashion. So let me give you an example. Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, absolutely horrible character. Anybody that reads the Bible can see that this God was promoting human sacrifice, was a jealous, envious God, demanded complete obedience. It was basically an out projection of the collective dark ego of humanity, and that was the God of the Old Testament. And the Gnostics called that out for what it was. Now, you have Jesus come along, and one of the radical things Jesus was teaching was a God of love. Jesus was not teaching the God of the Old Testament. So what happens there? Well, eventually, the church, the outer church, the church of the parables, the church of the lesser understanding, becomes the dominant branch of Christianity over the Gnostics who understood the inner mysteries. And they completely change everything back around. In the name of love, the church now takes over the place of Yahweh and rules completely over the minds and bodies of the people who have converted to Christianity for centuries. And all kinds of atrocities are committed under the name of Christianity, under the name of the church representing so-called God. Now, there are a lot of ways that humanity gets deviated from higher consciousness. I've just cited the religious way that things were handled in the past to deviate people from a higher consciousness, but it can happen in any number of different ways. We see this play of opposition run through our lives to greater or lesser extents. For every Hitler, there's going to be a Churchill. For everything that we try to achieve in our own personal life, we always run into what seems to be opposition in the form of a person or in the form of events that stand between us and our goals. It really seems to be a principle of operation in the material world. Now, that's both good and bad. The good side of the principle of opposition is this. It's very interesting that in early Christian belief and in early Jewish belief, Satan was not this cloven-hoofed monster. Satan was the angel of opposition. His function was to create obstacles for humanity to overcome, and in that overcoming is where we would retain, or we would be able to remember our higher stations, our higher selves, and regain that which we had lost when consciousness descended. So opposition has kind of a two-edged sword. I mean, it has a side that, we view as evil, but it also has a side that causes us to endure things in order to grow stronger and overcome and reach a higher state, to transcend to a higher state. But one thing you have to remember is that we are part of that original source consciousness, that all-powerful source consciousness. And as such, our consciousness does have a decided effect in reality. Now, in the book Quantum Spirituality, I talk about how that manifests in terms of quantum physics and the human ability to actually collapse the quantum wave into reality. But again, that's not our focus here right now. The thing we have to understand is that our minds are very powerful, although they operate, for the most part, at a rather unconscious level. So the Jung and the Gnostics used to tell us that what we can recognize will save us. What we don't recognize and lies suppressed is the thing that really destroys us. So a lot of what it's about to raise your consciousness is to very much be in control of your thoughts and start to have an understanding of how these various forces work in our lives and how we can work with them, how we can work around them, and how we can use them to our betterment, as opposed to letting them write our script and control our lives in a negative way. But just remember this, the great gift that the Gnostics have given us, the gift that we are rediscovering, is that we are not these separated, helpless creatures who were born in original sin and pissed God off, and our whole purpose in life is to work to get back in His good graces. That's not the way it works. There is no sin except for the sin of forgetting. And sin, the original word, means to be off the mark. It means to miss the mark or go off on a tangent, which is what we did, which is what Sophia did. She went off on a tangent from the original unity, consciousness descended, and came down to the point of where we are right now. So that we really are, in many ways, the bridge between the material and the spiritual. And our purpose in life is to spiritualize the material and bring the experience of the material back to spirit. That is what we said before about God reflecting on itself to know itself and have experience at all levels of creation. That's the exalted purpose of humanity, and that's the gift of understanding that the Gnostics have given us. We've come to the end of our show. A big thanks to our producer, Bob. Please join me again every Tuesday of each month. This show will be archived on my Dreamvision 7 network page, accessible from my website, petercanova.com. That's petercanova.com. And until next time, remember, quantum spirituality is where the past and the present, where mysticism and science merge to show us our future.
This ends today's segment of Quantum Spirituality, the show where the past and present merge to show us our future. Join us the first Tuesday of each month for cutting-edge information and informative new episodes. This show will be archived on the Quantum Spirituality Dreamvisions 7 Radio Network website page, also accessible at petercanova.com. That's petercanova.com.
This is Dreamvision 7 Radio Network, uniting mankind with universal love. Our shows are created from the heart, bringing each listener to a place of divine enlightenment. Breathe, relax, and enjoy. Let life flow.